Communication under pressure is the most important presentation in this course. Teams operating in high pressure situations need to communicate effectively and accurately for three main reasons: to maintain a shared and an accurate mental model, to allow delegation of tasks and decisions to other members of the team, which is particularly important for the leader in terms of cognitively offloading. And also vitally, effective and accurate communication is essential to maintain team safety throughout the whole procedure. However, in my experience of operating in high pressure situations as part of teams, communication is the most common thing to be done poorly, frequently leading to error and poor performance. Poor communication amongst healthcare providers, amongst first responders, and in military situations can be catastrophic. In this presentation, we are going to discuss why communication is challenging in high pressure situations and what tools and techniques that we can use to improve communication in high pressure situations, to improve team dynamics, improve performance, and reduce error. This presentation is divided into 5 different sections. Initially, briefly, we'll talk about implicit and explicit communication. Then we'll talk about why communication in high pressure situations is challenging from a cognitive and psychological perspective and from a practical perspective. Following that, we will discuss a number of tools and techniques which we can use as individuals amongst our teams to improve communication. And then finally, we'll talk about how we can improve use of those tools and techniques in our own teams. We have to understand the difference between explicit and implicit communication. Explicit communication are the words that we use to express ourselves and to pass information from one person to another. Implicit communication is, however, just as important. That's about how we say those words and indeed how we appear to other members of the team in terms of our facial expression, our posture, and what our hands do. And that is particularly important in high stress situations. Let's talk about what the cognitive challenges are. What limitations cognitively and psychologically make it difficult for us to communicate when we're experiencing high pressure? One of the main things, as we've talked about previously, is our limited cognitive capacity to take on board information, to process it, and make decisions based on that information. And particularly in terms of communication, a lot of that is down to the limited size of our working memory, that part of our short-term memory that takes on board and registers information when we're communicating and makes a judgment based on that. Also important is our limited ability to multitask. For example, if we're carrying out a practical procedure or looking at some information whilst at the same time trying to communicate with another member of the team, then it is inevitable that that communication is not going to be as accurately received or transmitted. There's also the concept of heuristics. We'd all like to believe that we all think and make decisions analytically, taking on board all of the information that we receive, considering options and making judgments. However, most of the judgments and decisions that we make are based on pattern recognition, and we take shortcuts. That works very efficiently most of the time, but in some instances it can lead to error. In communication terms, in a high pressure situation, what often happens is that we will start to listen to what someone is telling us, and we will make a snap judgment about what information they're trying to perceive, and we'll jump to a conclusion before listening to the full transmission of information. And that can commonly lead to miscommunication. We also need to be aware of the serial position effect, which is a type of cognitive bias. If we are trying to pass over multiple pieces of information in the one transmission, for example, during a pre-event briefing, and we're trying to, say, pass information about 6 different pieces of information, what happens is that the people that are listening to us will pay attention and recall the first 2 things that they're told and the last thing that they're told. They will pay little attention to the middle pieces of information, and they won't register with them. So the serial position effect has to change the way that we communicate information to the team, making briefing information shorter, or if we have to pass multiple pieces of information at the one time, making sure that the really important mission critical pieces of information are at the start of our transmission. We also have to consider the stress response. When the pressure becomes excessive and we get that surge and release of adrenaline and cortisol, and we move into that zone of frazzle and stress response. What happens at that point is that our body develops a cognitive appraisal of threat, and we focus on the problem in front of us. And that means that when we are under excessive pressure, that our peripheral vision deteriorates. We develop tunnel vision, focusing on the problem which is right in front of us. And similarly, our hearing decreases. This is an evolutionary response to reduce distractions, taking our attention away from a potential assailant. So when we're actually communicating with someone who is in the zone of frazzle, who's stressed, their physical ability to hear us decreases, and they have lost their peripheral vision. And similarly, the stress response has a considerable effect on our implicit communication. This is Neil Lennon, the Celtic manager, at a press conference, who's been simply asked a difficult question. He is unable to differentiate a physical threat to himself from a threat to his reputation. And you can see, because of that surge of adrenaline and cortisol, what his forehead is doing, what his eyes are doing. He's showing his teeth. He's developed a very rigid posture, and you can see what his hands are doing. So if we develop a stress response and we start to exhibit these physical signs as part of implicit communication, it states very clearly to the rest of the team that we have lost personal composure and we have lost situational control. Related to that is the concept of mirroring. We're all programmed for social acceptance. And one of the ways that we do that is actually by subconsciously mimicking those that we are interacting with. We can subconsciously mimic their facial expressions, their body posture, or even sometimes their accents. So what that means is, in a high pressure situation, when one person has lost personal composure, it almost becomes infectious in the rest of the group. We also have to consider communication when we're working in teams, especially certain types of teams. We need to be conscious of how command gradients can impair effective communication. In many groups, there's a rank structure with one single person in charge. Other people of a lower rank may feel impaired from speaking up about something that they are concerned about. And that can be for two reasons. One, it can be that they see the person in charge as being all-knowing, and that the thing that they're concerned about will be known about by the person in charge, and therefore they don't feel that they need or can speak up. Also, a lot depends on how that person in charge has responded when a member of the team has spoken to them already, based on their previous experience. If they have been chastised or criticised for speaking up, that will impair them from speaking up about something they're concerned about in the future. And similarly, groupthink can impair communication in a high-pressure situation. For example, if there were 6 people in a team and the person in charge, especially if they were quite a dominant person, were to express their mental model to the group and say what needed to be done, it could be that all of the group disagreed with that leader because they had the wrong or an inaccurate mental model. But no one singly within the group will speak up because of groupthink. They assume that they are the only person in the group that disagrees with the leader's mental model, and because other people are not speaking up, they think that they are the only person with that different mental model, and therefore that they are wrong and the rest of the group is right. So when we're working in teams, we need to be aware of command gradient and groupthink and how that can impede effective communication. When we're tired, communication is difficult as well. And that's in 2 ways. It adversely affects our ability to communicate. When we're tired, when we're sleep deprived, our ability to interpret facial communication and other people who are communicating with us is impaired. Our ability to understand changes in tone in their voice is impaired. And also, for example, when they're trying to be humorous. And that often leads to miscommunication. Also, when we're tired, we take the path of least resistance. So if someone tells us some information and we find it confusing, if we weren't tired, then we might seek clarification. But if we are tired, we're more likely to acquiesce and not question things, leading to communication error. So there are a number of cognitive and psychological limitations which make communication difficult. Our limited cognitive capacity, heuristics, the concept of the serial position effect, our stress response on our hearing, on how our vision, and indeed our implicit communication to the rest of the team, which is linked to the mirroring phenomenon. And when we're working in teams, depending on the culture of that team and the person in charge's leadership style, communication can be impaired by command gradients and groupthink. And communication is particularly difficult when we're tired. In addition to those cognitive challenges, we've also got practical challenges with communication. Time pressure is present in almost all high pressure situations, and that makes communication difficult for a number of reasons. When we're under pressure, we tend not to prepare what we are going to say before we say it, and that can lead to garbled communication. We tend to speak more quickly, which makes it more difficult to understand. And again, similar to fatigue, under time pressure, if someone passes us information which we find confusing, we're less likely to stop them and seek clarification. Communication in flash teams is always difficult. A flash team occurs when different professional groups come together in a high pressure situation. These different groups have different priorities, different skill sets, different types of knowledge, even can have their own language, and we don't know people's first names. And all of those can combine to make communication in a high pressure situation involving a flash team very difficult. And linked to that is jargon. If we've got jargon within our own team or our own profession, then we can have very precise, abbreviated ways of communicating situations or tasks which need to be carried out. And those can be communicated succinctly and accurately and understood by the rest of the team. But if we're working in a multidisciplinary team, especially a flash team, then other people around us may not understand our jargon and may misinterpret it, leading to error. We also have to think about environmental pressures on our ability to communicate, and that's a particular problem for those of us who work in search and rescue or in the pre-hospital environment, particularly with weather, with wind, cold, with noise and vibration. But even within a hospital or an internal environment, pressures such as phones ringing, etc., can cause problems for communication. And if we are trying to receive or to pass information, distractions and divided attention will impair the efficiency of the reception and transmission of that information. Such as phones ringing, or trying to look at patient monitors, or there being transmissions on a radio, which distract us and reduce our focused attention on the person that's trying to communicate with us. So there are multiple practical difficulties of communicating in a team in a high pressure environment, particularly time pressure, flash teams, use of jargon that other professions might not understand, environmental pressures, particularly if we're working outdoors, and distractions and divided attention. But what can we do? What tools and techniques can we use to try and overcome those challenges? A pre-event or a pre-shift briefing is really important to set the scene for effective communication. Atul Gawande in the Checklist Manifesto describes how the World Health Organization introduced a pre-operative checklist for use in surgical operating theatres, and the positive effects that had on team communication and patient safety. A briefing allows us to gain a shared and accurate mental model. What is actually happening to us? What is expected of each member of the team? What is each member of the team's roles? And what are we trying to achieve? A spin-off of having a briefing where each person introduces themselves is that later on they feel more empowered to speak up if they've got any concerns. And that partially overcomes command gradients and overcomes the limitations of groupthink. So effective briefings, if they're well structured and well led, can set the scene for effective communication in a team in a high pressure situation. Actually, simply pausing before you say something can be hugely effective in improving your communication. A pre-transmission pause, thinking about what information we want the person we're speaking to take on board, and target that information and structure it properly. So simply pausing and thinking before we speak. Choosing the right time to speak is important, not when the person we're speaking to is carrying a physical task or maybe distracted. Trying to choose the location away from distractions is important, finding out if the person is ready to receive the information, and making sure that you've got their focused attention by using their name, ensuring they've got eye contact with them, or maybe even putting your hand on their shoulder. So making sure that they are ready to receive that information without other distractions. Also, we need to think about how we say things in terms of pace and intonation. Changing the tone of our voice and slowing the pace when we are trying to pass on critical pieces of information can be very effective. One technique which is commonly used in the aviation industry is closed loop communication. For example, if a pilot is wanting to land at an airport, they'll express that desire to air traffic control, who will pass information to them about what runway to land on, what the ground air pressure is, and what the wind is doing. And the pilot will repeat that back to air traffic control, who will confirm that the pilot has received that information thoroughly and accurately. So closed loop communication, we pass the information onto a recipient. They read it back, ideally word for word, and we confirm that they have received that information accurately and thoroughly to close the loop. Similar to jargon is the concept of keywords, words that are easily understood within the rest of the team, and they have got a pre-agreed meaning to pass on information about delegating a task or to update on the mental model. And they can be a very rapid and accurate way of passing information in a team that's well known to you. A good example of that might be a group of soldiers out in patrol, and if one of them shouts "contact right," each member of that team will know exactly what their teammate is communicating, and they'll all know what actions to take. Repetition is a useful tool as well, especially for very critical information and information that involves numbers, such as drug doses or ages or a grid reference. So, for example, if I'm handing over a patient after a pre-hospital response in the emergency department, and I'm trying to pass over drug doses to the trauma team, I will say that I've given them 150 milligrams of ketamine, and then I'll repeat that by stating 150 milligrams of ketamine. So repetition, especially if you change the way that you're saying something, can be very effective. To try and get over the serial position effect, having a standardized structure for communication can be important. For example, any first responder arriving at a multiple casualty major incident or trying to communicate a situation report uses the methane mnemonic. What that means is that it ensures that the information that they transmit is structured, it's thorough, and the people that are receiving it know what's going to happen next, and it maintains focused attention, reducing the chance of inaccurate or incomplete information passage and the effects of the serial position effect. Another technique which is useful, particularly to try and avoid a command gradient, is graded assertiveness. An example of this is the CUS technique, which is used within the health service. And that's a mnemonic for someone who of a lower rank expressing to someone in a more senior position that they are concerned about what's happening. For example, a junior doctor in an operating theatre when a surgeon is going to take out the wrong kidney. So they start off by saying that they're concerned about what's happening. If that is not effective, then they state that they're uncomfortable about what's happening. If that's ineffective, they say, this is not safe, up to the point ultimately they say, stop, this is not safe. So graded assertiveness to try and overcome command gradients. We talked earlier about the problems with environmental pressures, especially when working outdoors. We need to consider measures that we can take to reduce those environmental pressures. One thing that we do in mountain rescue and in retrieval is that we use these portable shelters or bothy bags, putting us and the casualty and other members of the team inside what is essentially a tent without poles. And that acts to remove the effect of wind, reduces noise, and reduces auditory and visual distractions from outside. And then we need to consider the value of a rally point, actually pausing with the team in a high pressure situation to achieve a shared mental model, to make a list of what needs to be done and prioritize those, and to delegate tasks. Now, instinctively, when we pause a group, the thing that we normally do is that the person in charge states what they think is happening, what needs to be done, and then delegates tasks. That actually brings in all of the limitations of command gradient and groupthink. What we really need to do to make this more effective is to start the rally point with other members of the team being asked for their opinion and their mental model of what's happening and indeed what they think needs to occur. So there are various solutions to the practical and the cognitive challenges of communication. Pre-event briefings, pausing and targeting thinking what we're going to say before we start transmitting information. Having a standardized structure for communication. Ensuring that we've got the focused attention of the person that is going to be receiving that information. Using techniques such as closed loop communication and repetition, and indeed using pace and intonation to emphasize particularly important points. Trying to control distractions and environmental pressures, and also we can use graded assertiveness to try and overcome command gradients. And finally, thinking about what we're doing when we have a rally point to achieve a shared mental model. So how do we, as individuals and as teams, try and improve our communication skills? How do we use those tools and techniques? Well, simply having an awareness and an understanding of the cognitive and the practical challenges of communications amongst teams in high pressure situations is vitally important. Using those tools and techniques in simulation is important. Actually setting out consciously to think about how well we're briefing, using focused attention, using structured communication techniques, and having rally points during our simulation is going to make us much more likely to use those different techniques effectively when we're in a high pressure operational situation. And indeed, post-event debriefs should have communication as part of the structured debrief. It should be mandatory to openly discuss how well communication went and if there were any issues, to allow each member of the team to reflect on their own communication performance. And that is done most effectively if we're able to have operational filming and we can use audio and visual footage of actual operations to help our debriefing, to look at how well or otherwise we communicated as teams and as individuals. So that was communication under pressure, the difference between implicit and implicit communication, and how implicit communication is just as important as what we say. Understanding the challenges, both cognitively and practically, about communication under pressure, and thinking about the dozen or so solutions in terms of tools and techniques that we can use, and indeed how we can develop our ability to use those different communication skills.